The snow had been falling since before Eleanor woke, and by the time she reached the high street, the whole of Maplethwaite was muffled under it, the rooftops white, the cobblestones a grey and treacherous ice beneath a thin white skin. She carried the merchant's correspondence in her arms, held against her chest inside her cloak, and she walked with the particular economy of a woman who has decided not to feel the cold. The Morning Post had brought 3 new letters from Harwick and Sons in London, and she had already read them twice in the small back room of Finney's cloth trade, and knew that one of them would require a careful answer. She had been keeping Mr. Finney's accounts since October, when it had become apparent that the shop would not survive Christmas without someone who could read a balance sheet and write a letter without misspelling the name of the creditor. Eleanor could do both. It was not a position she had sought. It was simply that she had looked at the ledger when Mr. Finney set it before her in some desperation, and she had seen at once where the confusion lay, and she had said so plainly in the way she said most things. The position had followed naturally, as positions sometimes do when there is no one else willing to do the work. She did not think about Mr. Frederick Holt. She had not thought about him in a deliberate way since November, when the informal arrangement, which had never been formally pronounced but had been understood by enough drawing rooms in the county to constitute a near certainty, had dissolved without ceremony. He had sent a letter. Not a long one. She had read it twice, folded it very neatly along its original crease, and placed it in the grate. The fire had been doing its work that evening, and the letter had not lingered. She was 24 years old. Her father had died the previous March, leaving her with his books and his mathematical exactness and very little else, and she lived now in her aunt's house on Pilcher Street and answered the morning correspondence before Mrs. Dorothea Ashby was dressed. She had not cried about Frederick Holt. She had counted the November ledger instead, which wanted balancing, and found 3 errors in the second column before supper. If you have ever spent a season watching someone do quiet, careful work in a world that keeps deciding it doesn't see them, you know the particular patience this story requires. The letter from Harwick and Sons concerned a debt of £47 outstanding since September, and Eleanor had already composed the reply in her head before she reached Finney's door. The snow was coming down harder now, and the street was largely empty, the ordinary on the corner with its shutters still drawn, its chimney showing no smoke. She noticed this in passing, the way she noticed most things, without stopping, without altering her pace, filing it in the part of her mind that filed observations for later use. She did not notice the man standing at the back entrance of the cloth shop until she had nearly reached the door herself. He was sheltering under the narrow overhang of the trade entrance, his coat dark with wet, his hat pulled low, his hands tucked under his arms against the cold. He was not a young man and not an old one, somewhere in the middle range that winter weather ages faster than it ought. He was tall, he was very still. When he heard her footsteps on the stones, he raised his head, and she saw a face that was not ill-looking, and eyes that were steady in a way she associated not with labouring men, but with men who had spent some time managing difficult situations. She dismissed this observation as quickly as she made it, because it was not useful. "The ordinary is not yet open," she said, because it was evidently where he had been trying to go. "Their fire was out last night. I expect it is still out this morning." She considered him briefly. The coat was rough and wet, and the boots were serviceable rather than fine, and there was nothing about his outward presentation that would have attracted a second glance from anyone on the high street. "The merchant's back room has a fire if you want to come in out of the snow. I'm going there now, and the kettle will be on before long." He said, "Thank you." Just that. 2 words, spoken without excess and without anything that sounded like performance. He followed her inside. She set down the correspondence, lit the second lamp, and filled the kettle from the jug on the side table. He stood near the fire without taking the chair she had not offered, which struck her as correct, and she was aware of his presence the way she was aware of the cold outside. As a fact, present and noted, requiring nothing further from her. "You are the woman who manages Finney's books," he said after a moment. "I am," she said. He said nothing more. She set the kettle on the trivet and opened the correspondence from London, and the morning went on around them in the small back room, the snow tapping lightly at the single small window, the fire doing its ordinary work. She had noticed, before she turned her attention entirely to the letters, that his hands, when he took the cup she poured, were clean and steady and unblemished in a way that did not correspond to the wear on his boots. She did not mention this. She turned the page of the Harwick letter and began to compose her reply. It was a Tuesday in November, 7 weeks into winter, and Eleanor Ashby had begun to build something, though she had not named it that yet. Mrs. Dorothea Ashby had opinions about the matter of the broken betrothal, and she held them firmly, and she expressed them with the confidence of a woman who has decided her own assessment of a situation is the same thing as the facts of the situation. She held court in the morning room on Pilcher Street, most days between the hours of 10 and 12, and Eleanor had learned over the month since her father's death to time her departures to Finney's accordingly. This morning she had not timed it carefully enough. "You cannot continue at the shop," her aunt said, without turning from the window where she was watching the snow. She said it the way she said most things that she had already decided, with a completeness that left no space for the other person to have heard it differently. "It is one thing to have helped in an emergency, Eleanor. It is another to make a habit of it that the whole town has noticed." "The whole town needs its fabric and its notions," Eleanor said, "and someone must keep the accounts." "Someone," her aunt said, "not you." Mrs. Ashby was a handsome woman in her late 50s with a gift for making expressions of care sound like corrections. She turned from the window. She had in her hand a calling card that she set down on the side table with the small, deliberate click of someone placing a piece in a game. "Mr. Crane has expressed his intentions very clearly. He is a man of some means and a respectable household, and he requires a capable woman to manage it. I have told him, you are exactly such a woman. A woman who keeps accounts for a cloth merchant is not, Eleanor, the sort of woman a man like Mr. Crane requires." Mr. Silas Crane was 51 years old and had buried 2 wives, and had a manner of addressing women that suggested he found them mildly irritating, even when he was attempting to be agreeable. Eleanor had met him twice at her aunt's evening table. She had found both meetings instructive. "I am not going to marry Mr. Crane," Eleanor said. "What Frederick Holt did," her aunt said with the particular gentleness of someone picking up a piece of glass to examine it for damage, "is done. You cannot alter it. You can only manage what comes after it with some wisdom." Eleanor stood. She gathered the leather folder where she kept the morning's correspondence. She looked at her aunt, who was watching her with the expression of a woman who expects compliance eventually and is willing to wait. She said, "I will be at Finney's until 4. And she went to the door, and she did not give her aunt the satisfaction of watching her face. She walked to the shop in the cold, and she did not think about what she had left unsaid. She thought about the Harwick letter instead. There was a way to phrase the debt renegotiation that would serve everyone decently, and she had not quite found it yet. And the problem was a better use of her mind than Mr. Crane. The merchant's storeroom had a thin door, and Eleanor had known this since October. She had been in the back room a dozen times when Mrs. Holt had called upon Mrs. Finney in the front of the shop, and the door had not been built to contain a conversation between 2 women who felt no reason to lower their voices. Eleanor was not in the storeroom by design on the afternoon of the second week of December. She was there because she had gone to retrieve the September ledger from the lower shelf, and she had set it on her knee to check a figure, and the voices had begun before she could rise. Mrs. Holt spoke first. She had the carrying voice of a woman accustomed to being listened to in rooms larger than this one. I had not expected Dorothea to be so forthcoming, but she was quite clear about the situation. And Frederick listened, said another voice, lighter and drier. Eleanor recognized Mrs. Finney, who was a careful woman, and generally said little in the way of opinion. Of course he listened, Mrs. Holt said. When a woman of the household writes to you directly before any formal engagement is made, and tells you the girl has no settlement and a willful disposition that has already cost the family one advantageous connection, what is a sensible man to do? There was a pause in which Eleanor heard the sound of the tea service being set down on the counter. Dorothea wrote to him directly, Mrs. Finney said, in a tone that was not quite a question. In September, quite privately. She told him the girl had a difficult character and a father who had left her nothing useful, and that any man who entered into an arrangement with her without full knowledge would find himself poorly served. Mrs. Holt's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone repeating useful information. She told him that the situation in the Ashby household was difficult enough that the girl was already keeping books for you, which is not, of course, what one expects of the woman one intends to install in one's drawing room. The storeroom was very quiet. The September ledger was still open on Eleanor's knee. She was aware of the shelf at her back and the cold from the lower stones, and the particular stillness of a room when the person inside it has stopped breathing in order to hear more clearly. Dorothea wrote to Frederick Holt, Mrs. Finney said again more flatly. To protect Eleanor, Mrs. Holt said. Or so she described it. She did not want the girl to enter an arrangement with a man who would later find her unsuitable and then have the breaking of it carry more public weight than it has now. Eleanor set the ledger on the shelf. She did it very quietly, without disturbing the dust on the shelf beside it. She rose. She stood in the storeroom for one moment that she permitted herself to feel the full weight of what she had heard, and then she pressed her hands flat against the wooden shelf, and she breathed out slowly through her nose. And then she straightened, and she went back to her desk in the back room, and she picked up the Harwick letter, and she worked until the light failed. She did not tell anyone. There was no one to tell. There was Mrs. Hatch at the haberdashery 2 doors down, who was kind in the manner of a woman who has survived considerable difficulty and respects the same quality in others, and who sometimes brought Eleanor a cup of something warm when the afternoon was long. Mrs. Hatch would understand, but Eleanor had no need of understanding right now. She had need of the Harwick letter and the correct phrasing, and the winter settling around the shop like a kept promise. She walked home through the dark at 4 o'clock, and she went directly to her room, and she did not go down to supper, and her aunt did not come to ask why. This was the condition of the house on Pilcher Street, that an absence was treated as a convenience, and a silence was treated as consent. Eleanor lay on her back in the dark with her hands folded on her chest, and she thought, with great clarity, about what she was going to do next. She was not going to say anything about what she had heard. She was not going to weep. She was not going to marry Mr. Crane. She was going to complete the winter ledger for Finney's, settle the Harwick debt, and put her own name to the work. She lay there for a long time in the cold, and the resolution settled into her the way a good answer settles when you have finally found it. Quietly, without ceremony, with the relief of the thing being exactly the right shape for the space it needed to fill. The first proximity scene of any consequence happened on a Friday afternoon in the second week of December. 3 days after the storeroom and its thin door. Mr. Vane had come into the shop for fabric, a transaction he completed in the front with Mr. Finney in fewer words than most customers used, and he had found Eleanor in the back room with a column of figures that would not resolve. If you carry the November balance forward before applying the outstanding credit, he said from the doorway, the December column will read correctly. She looked up. He was standing in the door with his hat in his hand and his coat damp again at the shoulders, which meant he had walked from wherever he was staying, which was some distance from the high street. He was looking at the ledger, not at her. I see that now, she said. She was not annoyed by the observation. She was interested in it, and in the fact that he had made it without being asked and without preamble, in the way of someone for whom correct figures were their own justification. He came in and stood at the other side of the desk, and they looked at the ledger together, which was a thing that did not happen in the morning rooms of Hampshire, a woman and a man examining a column of accounts as if they were simply two people who both understood what they were looking at. You did not grow up in a merchant household, she said. No, he said. She did not pursue it. She corrected the carry forward and the column resolved, and he watched her do it with the attentive stillness of a man accustomed to watching things be done correctly. When she set the pen down, he asked about the Harwick situation, because he had apparently been thinking about it from the earlier conversation, and she told him, and they spoke about it for nearly half an hour in the small back room with the fire doing its work and the afternoon going grey outside the window. It was not remarkable. It was simply the particular warmth of being spoken to as if what one said had weight, and the fire was low by the time she realized how long they had been there. The second proximity scene was a fortnight later, in the week before Christmas, when she was walking back along the high street in the last of the afternoon light, and he fell into step beside her without announcement. The light was the particular pale gold of a winter afternoon, when the sun is already gone, but the sky has not yet gone dark, and the high street smelled of cold stone and wood smoke and the bakery on the corner that had been burning something all afternoon. They walked the length of the street without speaking very much, and she was aware of the particular quality of his silence, which was the silence of a person who is not filling space, but is genuinely present in it. You are not from this county, she said. I have property in the north, he said. You are managing something here through the winter, she said. He looked at her sidelong with an expression she had begun to recognize, a tension that did not announce itself as a tension. I am, he said. So am I, she said. And this seemed to settle something between them, though she could not have said what. And she walked the rest of the way to Pilcher Street, carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature and everything to do with the fact that someone had said, without meaning to, that the work she was doing was the same kind of thing as work. The third proximity scene was in January, on an afternoon when the fire in the back room went entirely out and they were both there. He having come to discuss a fabric order for the northern property, and she in the middle of the most difficult letter she had yet had to write, which concerned the renegotiation of the Harwick debt in terms that were firm but would not give offence. There was one taper left in the holder, and it was nearly down, and rather than stop the work, she had set it between them on the corner of the desk, and they had worked by its light, which was the light of close rooms and old libraries, amber and narrow, and the cold had come in from the window, and she had been aware of him very close, the particular warmth of a person not yet touching you, who is nevertheless present in the space between. She had looked up at one point and found him looking at her, not at the papers. She looked back down. She said, "You disagree with the phrasing of the third paragraph." "I think it concedes too much," he said. His voice was different in the candlelight, not louder, simply more itself. You have done all of the work of establishing the correct balance. You should not then soften the claim. If I do not soften it, she said, they will take offense and delay the payment. They will take offense, he said, and pay promptly, because a woman who writes in those terms is a woman they will not want to argue with in writing. She considered this. She considered, in the same moment, the fact that he was speaking of her as if she were capable of being formidable, which was not a quality she had heard ascribed to her in some time. She did not revise the third paragraph that afternoon. She let the taper go down to its last inch, and she rewrote the paragraph entirely the following morning, before her aunt was dressed. And it was harder than the earlier version and cleaner, and she sent it to London with the midday post and did not think about it again. The letter came back in 3 days with a bank draft for £47 and a note expressing confidence in Finney's continued business. She held the draft for a moment before she set it on Mr. Finney's desk. It was a small piece of paper, and it had taken 3 months and the specific application of her entire mind to produce it, and it sat in her hand with the weight of something that belonged to her, which it was not, and she set it down with care. The winter was nearly done. She could feel it in the quality of the morning light, which had shifted imperceptibly towards something that was not quite warmth, but was no longer the flat cold white of January. February had brought a week of milder days, and then another freeze, and Maplethwaite had settled back under its ice in the way of a place that does not trust improvement. Eleanor had spent 3 evenings writing the winter ledger. She did it in the back room of Finney's after the shop closed, by the light of 2 lamps, with the complete accounts of the previous 4 months spread across the desk in the order she had imposed on them. She had learned a great deal about the cloth trade between October and February. She had learned that the trade, like most things, was less complicated than it appeared and more particular than anyone admitted, and that the specific particulars that mattered were exactly the ones that Mr. Finney had been recording in the wrong column for 11 years. The ledger was finished on the 3rd of February, a Tuesday in the late afternoon. She had written the final figures, balanced the columns to the penny, and then she had sat for a moment with the completed book in front of her and the particular stillness of work that is done. She had then taken a fresh sheet of paper and written the covering letter to Mr. Harwick's firm in London, summarising the winter's accounts and indicating that the shop's credit position was now clear. She had written, at the foot of the letter, in her father's hand, which was also her hand, E. Ashby, account, her name, on a letter that would be read in London, in the specific context of commerce and legible work. She had not asked Mrs. Ashby's permission. She had not told anyone she intended to do it. She folded the letter and sealed it and added it to the post bundle on Mr. Finney's desk, and she put her cloak on and picked up her things. And she was in the doorway of the back room when she became aware that Mr. Vane was standing in the main door of the shop, watching her. She did not know how long he had been there. She did not say anything about the letter. He did not say anything about the letter. He held the shop door open for her to pass through into the cold, and they stood for a moment on the threshold, while the last of the afternoon light came down the high street in that particular pale and honest way it has in early February, low and clear, touching everything without favour. She could feel that he knew, though she could not have said how. She could feel the particular quality of his regard, which was not surprise, and was not indulgence, and was not anything that a person says to a woman they are condescending toward. She walked home. Her aunt met her in the hall of Pilcher Street with an expression that indicated the news had already arrived by the faster route of neighbourhood commentary. "You have signed a commercial letter with the family name," Mrs. Ashby said. "I have signed a letter with my name," Eleanor said. "It is the same thing," her aunt said. "It is my name," Eleanor said, and went upstairs. The town did not approve precisely, but it did not entirely disapprove either, because the Harwick debt had been settled and the shop was standing, and these were facts that the town, which depended on the shop, found difficult to argue with. Mrs. Hatch at the haberdashery 2 doors down said something warm and specific to Eleanor on the following morning, in the way Mrs. Hatch had of naming things accurately without ceremony. "Your father would have had the same hand on the columns," she said, and went back to her notions. And Eleanor carried that sentence to Finney's and set it on the back shelf of her mind next to the £47 and the clean ledger and the letter that had already gone. Mr. Vane was not at the shop that week. She noticed this without surprise, understanding that he came and went according to the business of the property he was managing, and that she had not been owed his presence and had not sought it and would not seek it now. She thought about the candlelight and the 3rd paragraph. She thought about the way he had spoken of her as someone capable of being formidable. She set the thoughts on the shelf with the other things and went back to the spring accounts, which were beginning to need attention. The morning of the 17th of February began with Mr. George Finch's carriage drawing up in front of the shop just after 10:30, which was unusual because Mr. Finch was a landowner of the first consequence in the county and had not previously conducted his fabric business in person. He was a round-faced, pleasant man in his 60s with the absent-minded directness of the comfortable landowning class, and he came through the shop door with a specific purpose that was evidently related to a property transaction, because he was already saying something about an easement on his way through the front room. He stopped in the middle of the front room. Eleanor looked up from the back room doorway, where she had been standing with the February accounts in her hands. Mr. Vane was at the counter. He had come in 15 minutes earlier to discuss the spring fabric order, which was the first sign that the property work was entering a new season, and Eleanor had been aware of him with the particular warm attention that had accumulated across the winter's small, ordinary proximity. He was in his usual coat, which was neither fine nor rough, and his hat was in his hand. He was, to all appearances of the high street of Maplethwaite, a man of no particular consequence at the cloth merchant's counter. Mr. Finch said, "Lord Vane." He did not say it as a question. He said it with the particular matter-of-fact warmth of a man addressing someone he has known for 20 years, whose presence here is slightly surprising, but whose existence is simply itself. "I did not know you were in Hampshire. Your steward wrote to me last November to say Hartmoor was to be managed remotely through winter. I had not understood you were managing it yourself." The room went still. The particular quality of the stillness was this. Mrs. Hatch had come to the door of the haberdashery, 2 doors down, and was visible through the front glass, and Mr. Finney was behind the counter with his hands on a bolt of wool, and Eleanor was in the doorway, and none of them said anything for the span of several complete breaths. Mr. Vane did not move. He looked at Mr. Finch with an expression that was composed and unsurprised, in the way of someone who has been waiting for a door to open and is not startled when it does. He said, "Mr. Finch, I have been managing some local matters. I had not expected to be recognized." Lord Vane, Eleanor thought. She was aware of the February accounts in her hands. She was aware of the candlelight and the thin back-room door and the morning of the snow, and a cup of tea poured for a man in a wet coat who had thanked her without surplus and stood near the fire without presumption. Lord Vane of Hartmoor. She kept her hands very still around the papers. Mr. Finch was saying something about the easement, because that was what he had come for, and he was a man of steady purpose, and Mr. Vane, Lord Vane, was answering him with the same measured brevity that had characterized every exchange Eleanor had ever witnessed him in, and the room was reorganizing itself around the fact of his rank the way a room does when the ground shifts, slowly, audibly, one person at a time. Mrs. Ashby arrived 12 minutes later for her habitual morning call to Mrs. Finney, which she paid every other Tuesday and which Eleanor had not known she was planning for today, which meant that Mrs. Ashby had made the arrangement to coincide with a time when Eleanor would already be at the shop. She came through the front door with the particular composed expression of a woman who has arranged her morning well, and she saw Mr. Finch, who she recognized from the assemblies, and she saw Eleanor, who she looked at with the expression of one who has already calculated the argument, and then she saw the man standing at the counter with Mr. Finch, and Mr. Finch said pleasantly, as one says the name of a peer to a stranger who might not yet know it, "Mrs. Ashby, allow me to present Lord Vane of Hartmoor." The expression on Mrs. Ashby's face was not quick to change. It went through several stages in succession, each of which Eleanor recognized, and the last of which was the one she had been waiting for without knowing she had been waiting, the stage at which the calculation was complete and the result was not what the calculus had promised. Lord Vane turned from Mr. Finch. He looked at Eleanor and then he looked at Mrs. Ashby, and his expression carried nothing that announced itself as a verdict. He said, "I have been very well served by Miss Ashby's management of the shop's accounts. The work this winter has been thorough and precise, and I do not think I have seen better correspondence with a London creditor in some years." He said it the way he said most things, without excess, without performance, in the bearing of a man who has been addressed as Your Grace his entire life and does not require elevation from anyone in the room. He said it as a simple fact, the way one states the resolution of an account, plainly, in the smallest sufficient words. Mrs. Hatch had come inside. Mr. Finney had set down the bolt of wool. Mrs. Finney had appeared in the door from the back room, drawn by a quality of silence that drew people. Mrs. Ashby stood in the front room of Finney's cloth shop with her calling card in her hand, and the morning reorganized irrevocably around her. She said, "Lord Vane," and her voice had the sound of someone reading from a script that has stopped corresponding to the situation. He acknowledged her with the brief, courteous nod of a man who is concluding a social exchange. He turned back to Mr. Finch and the easement discussion. There is a particular kind of social collapse that does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself. It is the drawing room gone still, the dinner table that has shifted its attention, the neighbours who were watching and have now seen what they needed to see. It is not cruelty. It is not punishment. It is simply reality arriving in the room where it has been kept out and declining to be managed. Mrs. Ashby stood in Finney's front room for several minutes, and then she made a conventional excuse about a prior engagement, and she went back out into the February street, and the door closed behind her with the sound of nothing in particular. Mrs. Finney and Mrs. Hatch exchanged a brief look of the particular variety that requires no words, and Mrs. Hatch went back to her haberdashery, and Mr. Finney picked up the bolt of wool, and the ordinary business of the morning resumed. Eleanor had not moved from the doorway. She stood with the February accounts in her hands, and she looked at Lord Vane, who had finished with Mr. Finch and was now looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, or had perhaps seen and not named. It was not uncertain, it was not performing anything. It was simply the expression of someone who has done the thing they intended and is now waiting to see what comes next, in the manner of a man who has been waiting patiently for something and is content to continue waiting. "You were a lord," she said. "I am a lord," he said. "I was also this winter the man at the counter with the fabric order for the Northern Estate and an opinion about your third paragraph." She looked at him. She thought about the shawl she had not worn that morning, because the day had been too warm for it, which was the first day since November that had been too warm for it. She thought about the crocus she had seen at the base of the garden wall at the back of the shop on Thursday, a single early one, pale yellow, indifferent to the cold. "You might have told me," she said. "You would have treated me differently," he said. "You would have been correct and careful, and you would not have argued about the third paragraph." "I argued because you were wrong," she said. "You argued because you were right," he said, "and you were not going to be told you were wrong by anyone, regardless of what they were." She held this for a moment. "The Harwick letter," she said, "was exactly as good as I told you it was," he said. "The phrasing of the third paragraph was yours, not mine, and it was better than mine, and I was glad to have been wrong about it." Mrs. Hatch put her head around the haberdashery door and looked at them with the expression of a woman who has been in this town for 40 years and has seen several things and is prepared to see one more. And then she withdrew her head and the door was closed again, with a discretion that was itself a kind of warmth. Lord Vane said, "There are things I would like to speak about, if you are willing." "I have the February accounts still," Eleanor said. "They will wait," he said. "I'm asking if you are willing." She set the February accounts on the counter. She considered the question with the same thoroughness she had brought to every problem this winter, looking at it cleanly, without the distortion of what she had been told to expect, only the thing itself. "Yes," she said. The February accounts waited on the counter. The fire in the back room was still burning from the morning. The shop was quiet in the way it was quiet after business had been conducted and the result was settled. And the door stood open and the winter light came in from the street, and it had the quality that particular winter light has when it is nearly done being winter. A brightness in it that is not quite spring, but is the first clear signal of spring's intention, and the whole high street of Maplethwaite was in it, the stones pale and clean after the morning frost. The situation of Mrs. Dorothea Ashby after the 17th of February was not comfortable. It was not cruel. The town did not make it cruel, because the town was not in the business of cruelty, but in the business of revision, of quietly correcting a misassessment in the way that people in a small place correct such things, through the gradual reorientation of whose name appears first in conversation, whose household is called upon with what quality of attention, whose opinion on matters of social arrangement carries the weight it previously did. Mrs. Ashby's opinion on the arrangement of Eleanor's future had, by the end of February, lost the audience it had previously commanded, and she was no longer in a position to conduct the morning rooms of the county on the subject of her niece's character and prospects without finding that the room had already been informed by other sources. This was not a loud correction. It was a structural one. It was the kind of correction that the world of Regency England delivers at its most patient and precise, through the social arithmetic of who knows what about whom and what that arithmetic now produces. Mr. Crane called twice more and was received twice with the pleasant civility that Eleanor had always offered him, and received twice the same composed answer, which was no, though she expressed it in the period idiom of women who do not have the luxury of a direct refusal, and must construct one from smaller materials. After the second call he did not come again, which was a relief to both of them, and a mild inconvenience to no one. Mrs. Ashby did not speak about Lord Vane in Eleanor's presence. She did not speak about Mr. Finney's shop, or the letter to Harwick and Sons, or the winter accounts, or the February morning in the front room of the cloth merchants. She spoke about other things, with the careful energy of a woman who is managing a situation, and Eleanor let her manage it, and the spring came on around them both, indifferent to who had arranged what. The March accounts were Eleanor's own idea. Mr. Finney had not asked for them specifically, but the shop had turned a profit through the winter for the first time in 3 years, and the spring fabric orders from 3 county estates were already on the desk. and it seemed to Eleanor that the work was simply the continuation of what she had already been doing, which was keeping the accounts correctly in the way her father had kept accounts, with care and precision, and the particular satisfaction of a thing that balances. She sat at the desk in the back room on the morning of the 4th of March, and she opened the spring ledger to the first page, and she wrote the heading in her own hand, and she reached for the pen. The fire was small and good. Outside, the garden wall that backed onto the lane behind the shop had shown its crocus for the past week now, pale and improbable, and entirely certain of itself, the way early things are certain of themselves in the middle of the cold. She could see it from the window, briefly, if she turned at the right angle. She turned at the right angle. It was still there. She set the pen down on the desk, the ink ready, the spring ledger open. She heard footsteps on the shop floor that she recognized by their particular economy and their exact weight, and she turned back to the desk and picked up the pen, and she was already looking at the column when Lord Vane came to stand in the doorway. She said, without looking up, "The first order is from Hartmore." "I thought it should be," he said. She wrote the figure down. The column opened properly. The morning went on around them in the way of mornings that have their work and their warmth and their sufficient light. And outside on the garden wall the crocus did not require any acknowledgement from the world in order to continue.